Good evening, this is David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get updates to the forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look at one of the warnings that we have out for the state. This is a blizzard warning along the northwest coast, specifically from Point Lay and areas farther to the west. Again, this is a blizzard warning that's going to result in visibilities dropping down to a quarter mile less at times, as well as seeing winds up to as high as 45 miles per hour. This is going to be in effect until 6 p.m. on Friday. Down in the central Aleutians, we have a high wind warning that is in effect. It will start at 1 a.m. on Thursday and go until noon on Thursday. This is going to be for winds that are going to gust up to as high as 85 miles per hour. Again, a high wind warning for the central Aleutians. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, we can see several weaker lows moving through the Bering Sea, resulting in some snow showers out over the area. We have another low that's approaching the Kenai Peninsula area, resulting in some snow through much of the southern portions of mainland Alaska. Up along the Arctic coastline, can't see a lot of high movement of clouds, but we do see some areas of lower cloud cover with some of the stratus and fog up along much of the Arctic coast. And finally, we'll look way down to the southwest, south of the western Aleutian Islands as we see our next system coming in. This is going to be the one that's going to bring the high wind warning criteria to the central Aleutian Islands. For the remainder of today, we do have those lows out over the Bering Sea, bringing some snow showers throughout much of the Bering Sea. And then our low out over the Kenai Peninsula area brings some snow to southwest Alaska, as well as much of the southern mainland. Down in the Panhandle area, however, we are going to see some areas of fog, and some more fog from areas of AKwx further to the east. And then along the northwest coastline, we will see those areas of blowing snow. We have our stronger system approaching the western Aleutian Islands, starting to bring snow to the area, but we will see a push of southerly winds and warmer air coming up. Then for the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, we have another system approaching the area, but stalling out before it brings that precipitation to the area. As we move into tonight, that system is going to push off a little bit to the east, starting to bring some lighter snow to areas of Kodiak Island and the Alaska Peninsula. However, the main story is going to be our strong low pushing towards the western Aleutian Islands, down as low as 928 millibars for tonight, bringing in a lot of those stronger winds to the central and western Aleutian Islands, as well as some snow to the areas. However, with that push of warmer air from the south, we are expecting that to be a heavier snow, so we do not expect the blowing snow conditions to go down to a quarter mile or less at this time. As we move out over mainland Alaska, some fog for southwest Alaska and some lighter areas of snow throughout Kodiak Island and south central Alaska. Up along the Arctic coast, we're going to see some areas of fog, and then we're going to see blowing snow for the northwest coastline. Down in the Panhandle, we are expecting to see more fog for tonight. As we move into Thursday, that fog will clear up in the Panhandle area and just some lingering snow showers out for the eastern Kenai Peninsula and Kodiak Island areas. Up along the Arctic coastline, still seeing fog from areas of AKwx east, and then blowing snow for the northwest coastline. Our main low now down to 924 millibars by the western Aleutian Islands, still bringing strong winds to the central Aleutians, as well as some snow throughout the Aleutian Islands into much of the Bering Sea. As we move into Friday, that low starting to fill in and weaken a little bit, now at 937 millibars, but still quite a bit of stronger winds around that system, as well as a mixture of snow and rain by the western and central Aleutian Islands, snow from much of the Bering Sea and eastern Aleutians, and a mix of rain and snow for the Alaska Peninsula. Starting to get that snow into southwest Alaska as well, and some blowing snow by northwest coastline, as well as some areas of fog along the Arctic coast. We'll also see some precipitation out through much of the Gulf of Alaska, starting to be more snow as we get to those landlocked areas, with the exception of the Panhandle area where some of the southerly winds bringing up some warmer air, and we're going to see some rain for southern locations of the Panhandle, transitioning over to snow in areas farther to the north. Taking a look at our temperatures for Thursday morning, starting off in the Panhandle area, down to around 30 degrees for southern locations, into the 20s for northern locations. For south central Alaska, in the teens and interior locations, and then in the 20s as we get closer towards the water, with Kodiak at 28 degrees. Up in the interior, single digits for many locations until we get to areas in the north and east, where we will see temperatures going below zero, then well below zero along the Arctic coastline, getting into the negative 20s farther to the east. Down the west coast, primarily in the 20s, and then down in the 20s along the water for southwest Alaska, and the teens as we get to more interior locations. Down in the Aleutian Islands in the 30s, with St. Paul down to 29 degrees. Thursday afternoon highs, we're going to see near 40 for the southern locations of the Panhandle, and then as close as 28 for the Haines area farther to the north. In the south central area, in the teens for interior locations, and then in the 20s near the water once again. For the interior, Single digits to below zero out east, getting into the double digits as we get farther to the west. Below zero all along the Arctic coastline, only getting up into the minus 20s as we get into the eastern locations. Staying in the 20s for the west coast of Alaska with Savunga up to as high as 30 degrees, and then down in southwest Alaska in the 20s primarily. Near 40 for the Aleutian Islands and 37 for St. Paul. Friday morning, temperature is going to drop down into the 20s for northern locations of the Panhandle, near 40 for southern locations. Into the teens for some of the areas around south central Alaska, and right around 20 degrees as we get nearest to the water. Up in the interior portions of the state, central and eastern locations below zero with single digits for the west, and then into the negative 20s all along the Arctic coastline. Into the teens for along much of the west coast, a little bit warmer at Savunga, 23 degrees expected, and then near 20 for southwest Alaska with 30s for the Aleutians. Southeast Alaska is going to be near 40, and then the teens for much of south central, well below zero for much of the interior and Arctic coastline, and then southwest is going to be in the 20s and 30s for the Aleutian Islands.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Thursday morning. Out over the western portion of the Aleutian Islands and Bering Sea, we can see that front coming in, bringing some IFR conditions to the area. We also have some areas of IFR along much of the southwestern portions of the coast, down into the Alaska Peninsula, and then up north into the Norton Sound area. Throughout much of mainland Alaska, we are expecting MVFR conditions with some isolated areas of IFR around south central and eastern portions of the interior. Up along the Arctic coastline, MVFR conditions are expected, and then MVFR all around areas near the Gulf, to include much of the southeastern portions of the state. On Thursday afternoon, widespread MVFR conditions for the Panhandle area, as well as much of the Gulf of Alaska and areas around south central. Up in the interior, MVFR conditions primarily expected, with some areas of IFR further to the east. Up along the Arctic coastline, going to continue to see MVFR, and then a mixture of MVFR and IFR down the west coast of the state. Front out over the Bering and Aleutians, bringing some IFR conditions to the area, otherwise MVFR out over the Bering. For Friday morning, continuing to see primarily MVFR throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, with some areas of IFR by the western Aleutians, as well as some areas of IFR in the more northern locations of the Bering, extending down towards southwest Alaska. Up along much of the west coast of the state, primarily MVFR conditions expected. That includes the Arctic coastline as well, and then some areas of MVFR throughout interior Alaska. Down in south central, we're going to have a mixture of VFR with some isolated areas of MVFR, and then down through much of the Gulf, we're going to see some more MVFR extending out over Kodiak Island with some IFR for the Panhandle. Friday afternoon, continuing to see primarily IFR conditions for the Panhandle and more MVFR conditions for the Gulf of Alaska. South Central Alaska will primarily be VFR Friday afternoon, and some VFR conditions also for much of the rest of mainland Alaska, with the exception of some areas of IFR down in the eastern portions of the interior. Up along the Arctic coastline, expecting to see continued MVFR conditions, and then more MVFR conditions down the west coast, with some mixture of IFR as we get down into southwest Alaska. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, primarily MVFR conditions, with some areas of IFR farther out west by the western Aleutians. For our passes, starting up north at AKwx Pass, expecting to see VFR conditions on Thursday, as well as at Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill will both start off IFR and then improve to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Rainy Pass starting off IFR, improving to VFR in the afternoon. Windy Pass will start off marginal, also improving to VFR in the afternoon. Isabel Pass starting off IFR, improving to marginal conditions Thursday afternoon. Mentasta Pass should be MVFR throughout the day on Thursday, and Tanita should also be MVFR throughout the day on Thursday. Portage starting off IFR, then we'll jump up to MVFR in the afternoon, and Chilkoot and White will both start off VFR, dropping down to marginal conditions later in the day. For our freezing levels, our surface freezing line is moving through the northern portions of the Bering Sea, then down through southwest Alaska, right along the North Gulf Coast through the Panhandle area. Some area of warmer air south of the Panhandle area, we're starting to see those 2,000-foot freezing levels approach the southern portions of the Panhandle. Then up by the western Aleutians, that strong push of warmer air from the south is bringing up some higher freezing levels out over the central and western Aleutian Islands, with 4,000 feet making it over the Amchipka area. For our icing, starting off over the western portions of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, above 2,000 feet is expected from the central Aleutians to the western Aleutians. We're going to also see some areas above 4,000 feet approach the Alaska Peninsula from the south, and some areas by the western portions of the Kenai Peninsula above 2,000 feet there. For our jet stream, we are going to see Primary portions of the jet south of the Aleutian Islands up to as high as 120 knots out of a westerly direction, dropping down into the 85 to 90 knot range out over the Bering Sea, and then out over the Panhandle area up to as high as 110 knots out of a westerly direction. Down to 9,000 feet, strongest winds are going to be around our low by the western Aleutian Islands with 90 knots out of a westerly direction south of the low, around 75 knots out over the central Aleutian Islands out of a southwesterly direction, dropping down to 40 to 45 knots out of a south to southwest direction through the Bering Strait area as well as St. Lawrence Island. So out of the northeastern portions of the state, northwesterly winds 35 knots, and then out over the Panhandle, westerly winds 25 knots are expected. At 3,000 feet, once again, we're going to see the strongest winds near our low by the western Aleutians, 80 knots out of a westerly direction south of that low, 75 knots out of a southerly direction for the central Aleutian Islands, dropping down as we get closer towards the eastern Aleutian Islands, down to near 20 as we get by the Unalaska area. Up to the St. Lawrence Island area, southwesterly winds, 30 knots expected. Out over the northwestern portion of the state, 50 knots out of a southeasterly direction, and then getting towards 40 knots by the Alaska Peninsula. For our turbulence, with those stronger winds out over the Aleutians, we will see some isolated areas of severe turbulence for the central and eastern Aleutians below 4,000 feet, below 5,000 feet for some moderate turbulence for southwest Alaska, and below 4,000 feet for the Kotzebue Sound.
I can't really name anyone that has so much integrity as she does to the things that she's accomplishing. It's pretty amazing. Having Claire as a role model, just a strong woman in science and just so smart and so kind. It's just a huge confidence booster. Is that, hey, I could do that too, you know? That's possible, that's successful, that's what I want to do.
I would characterize her as a pioneer in the field.
The amount and quality of the work she's put out is second to none.
I know people who have a lot of tenacity. I know people that have integrity, but it's rare that people have both together in that, you know, that combination that Claire does.
Every morning, Dr. Claire Parkinson gets up before sunrise and runs 2 miles to work. She hasn't missed a day in nearly 40 years. To know the evolution of sea ice and how we observe it from space is to know Claire. This year, she's celebrating 40 years at NASA.
When I arrived at Goddard, which was in July of 1978, it was an incredibly exciting period here. Satellites were pretty new, but a lot of data had been collected.
NASA scientists were inundated with information, and Claire was in a cohort looking at sea ice, trying to make sense of a jumble of very raw, very new data. It was around that time that Claire and her team, at the time led by Dr. Jay Zwally, created the principal sea ice record that we use today.
How does something like that record help you do your job?
Oh, that record is fundamental to understanding sea ice. So without it, we wouldn't know how rapidly it's changing.
You may not realize it, but Claire's work studying the changing extent of the ice caps deeply affected our understanding of climate change, and relatedly, our understanding of how climate change affects life on Earth.
One of the clearest signals for climate change that resonates with people has been this shrinking of the polar ice cap in the summer that we're able to see because of Claire's work.
After we had a record that was about 15, 20 years long, we started noticing that the extent of the ice in the Arctic was getting smaller over time.
Sea ice is formed on the surface of the ocean, and therefore is made from seawater. the biggest concentration is in the Arctic, and it's also where the biggest loss in sea ice is occurring. Every year, NASA reports on the sea ice minimum and maximum extents. As expected, the data is concerning.
By now, not only has this trend toward lesser ice continued, but it's even accelerated, so that now the decreases are greater than what they had been.
These trends are deeply troubling, but one thing's for sure. Our awareness of shrinking sea ice extent due to climate change was propelled faster and further after Claire Parkinson arrived at NASA.
I mean, she takes her job seriously, and the health and welfare of those instruments in space, yeah, she's on it. You know, it's one of the things you don't worry about because Claire's in the loop on these things. It's going to be fine.
In science, we stand on the shoulders of giants, on the shoulders of those who explored before us. But then, some among us are giants.
For a scientist, it's incredibly exciting to be studying these glaciers and ice sheets right now because they're doing something that hasn't happened in thousands of years. We're watching changes take place that haven't happened since the end of the last ice age. Tuesday was cold, I almost froze my toes. Oh, what's it gonna be next week? Who knows? That's climate. Oh, that's the climate you got. You take a bunch of weather and you average it together and you're doing the climate rock.
At a glacial pace, it means something's happening so slowly you can barely tell it's happening at all. That used to describe the very incremental movement glaciers and ice sheets experienced each year. But now that's changing. We're tagging along with 3 NASA scientists to understand the different lengths they go to not only investigate ice sheets and glaciers, but also communicate their often complicated science to the public. First, let's get oriented. Ice sheets, in pink, pretty much occur in only 2 places, Antarctica and Greenland. Glaciers, in yellow, play a key role draining melt off the ice sheet. Glaciers are also found in the high mountains, but we'll get to those in another episode.
So we know that something's happening in Greenland right now that's unprecedented in the last several thousand years.
That's Dr. Josh Willis, oceanographer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Josh and his team are tackling one of the major environmental challenges of the 21st century, trying to answer fundamental questions about how melting glaciers impact sea level rise.
With my mission, Oceans Melting Greenland, or OMG for short, we're trying to understand just how much of Greenland's melt is caused by the oceans.
Along with being one of NASA's top scientists working on the cryosphere, Josh is passionate about demystifying climate change in typically unconventional ways.
I think by reaching out to people with a little bit of humor, a little bit of fun, maybe a song, you really have the opportunity to help people understand and come to terms with what we're doing to our planet. Because it's definitely happening and it's definitely a big deal, and we need to start preparing for it.
Down at the opposite pole, Dr. Kelly Brunt is getting ready for a major expedition.
In December and January this coming year, I'll actually be in Antarctica, down near the South Pole, collecting ground-based GPS data.
This is actually Kelly's second expedition to the South Pole. The first occurred in December and January of last year. Both surveys are critical and will help validate data collected by NASA's airborne campaign, Operation Icebridge, and the recently launched satellite mission ISAT-2.
All 3 of these layers, that ground-based, that airborne, and the satellite, are all tied together. The ground-based helps validate both the satellite and the the airborne helps give us more validation data for the satellites, but also a bigger story with respect to the depth of the ice sheet and what's going on underneath the surface.
While some scientists are taking measurements in the field, others are looking for answers in physics and lines of code.
For me, those projections that we are doing, they do have a very personal meaning.
Dr. Sophie Nowicki is an ice sheet modeler. That means she and her team have the important job of forecasting how ice will change in the future, which also predicts changes in sea level rise. It's a job she doesn't take lightly, especially since urban planning and infrastructure use her team's models to make decisions about the future and safety of their communities.
When we make those projections that are 100 years in the future, 100 years can seem so far away, like I don't have to worry about it, it's just too far. But actually they are not. It's really like the future that we are looking at that our children or grandchildren will see to experience.
Whether it's learning to communicate in new ways, traversing a swath of Antarctica in a massive piston bully, or taking responsibility for an impactful climate forecast, our NASA explorers are pushing the limits of discovery every day. But on a very human level, they're people with families and friends who have a stake in finding out why and how the planet is changing as rapidly as it is.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it. And so when we try to understand the thresholds for life, where life might exist, elsewhere in our solar system and the universe, water is one of those things that we look for.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section. We'll take a quick look at our ice edge. Starting off in the Bristol Bay area, the weather that we have been seeing has eroded quite a bit of the ice around Bristol Bay. The ice near the Kuskokwim Delta, however, has held on a little bit stronger. And then up in the Norton Sound area, we are seeing some areas of polynya, and that is going to also be true as we move up into the Kotzebue Sound area as well, seeing some polynyas up there. Taking a look at the marines for Thursday for southeast Alaska in the inside water, southeast winds 15 knots, becoming north 20 in the northern locations. Out over the Gulf waters, easterly winds are expected, 25 knots in the eastern locations, 10 to 15 up north. For Friday in southeast in the inside waters, northerly winds 15 to 25 knots, becoming southeast 25 in areas farther to the south. Out over the Gulf waters, starting off in the eastern locations, southerly winds 25 knots, becoming easterly and getting up to size 35 knots as we get closer towards Gustavus, and then as we get into northern locations, easterly winds 25 knots expected, seas up to as high as 19 feet, highest out over the eastern waters. For south central Alaska on Thursday, easterly winds out over the Gulf 15 to 20 knots, northeast winds 10 knots in Prince William Sound area. Cook Inlet area, northeast winds 20 to 30 knots, increasing as we move farther to the south, and then west of the Barren Islands, 35 knots are expected. On Friday for south central out over the Gulf waters, 20 to 25 knots out of an east to northeast direction. Prince William Sound, northerly winds 10 knots expected. In Cook Inlet, northeast winds 15 to 30 knots, once again picking up stronger as we move further to the south, and then northerly winds 30 knots west of the Barrens. For Thursday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, around Kodiak Island, easterly winds 25 to 30 knots expected, and then 20 to 30 knots as we move out by the Alaska Peninsula. Weakest winds are for Bristol Bay, seas up to as high as 18 feet, highest on the Pacific side. For Friday around Kodiak Island, easterly winds 30 knots expected, and then east winds 30 to 35 knots for our eastern locations of the Alaska Peninsula, then becoming more southerly as we get closer towards Cold Bay. Out of that southerly direction, around 35 knots, with seas up to as high as 20 feet, highest again on the Pacific side. Strongest winds, however, are going to be Thursday for the Aleutians. We are going to see winds up to as high as 75 knots, storm force winds up by the western Aleutian Islands, with seas up to as high as 56 feet. Again, that's by those western Aleutians. And then we are going to see stronger winds throughout the central and eastern Aleutians as well, out of a south to southeasterly direction, 65 knots for the central Aleutians, and down to around 50 knots for the eastern Aleutian Islands. On Friday, still strong, but weaker than we'll see on Thursday out by the eastern Aleutian Islands. Southwest winds 25 to 30 knots, getting up to 40 to 45 knots by the central Aleutians, with seas 36 feet on the Pacific side. Still strongest by the western Aleutian Islands. Southwesterly winds 50 to 55 knots expected, with seas up to as high as 44 feet. Along the west coast of the state, east to southeast winds 20 knots by Norton Sound, getting up to as high as 30 knots by the Nunavik Island area, 40 knots out of an easterly direction by St. Matthew Island, and then southeasterly winds 45 knots by the Pribilof Island, seas up to as high as 15 feet for the more western locations. On Friday, going to see easterly winds from most locations along the west coast, 25 knots in Norton Sound, 40 knots by the St. Lawrence Island area, 40 to 45 knots by Nunavik Island, 45 knots by St. Matthew Island as well, and then southerly winds 20 knots by the Pribilof Islands. Seas up to as high as 29 feet near St. Matthew Island. Up along the Arctic coastline on Thursday, northeasterly winds 10 to 15 knots, becoming easterly 20 by AKwx. Then as we drop down the west coast, we are going to see winds out of an easterly direction, 35 knots west of Wainwright, and then 20 to 25 knots down the rest of the west coast. On Friday, we're going to see east to northeast winds 20 knots along the Arctic coastline, 30 to 35 knots for northwestern locations, 20 knots near the Kotzebue Sound area, and easterly winds 40 knots south of the strait. Recap of our weather for tonight. We have that strong system moving up in the western Aleutians with a low dropping down to 928 millibars. Quite a bit of strong winds with this. We will see the high wind warning that will take effect for the central Aleutian Islands. That's going to happen on 1 a.m. on Thursday, and that's going to go until noon on Thursday, gusting up to as high as 85 miles per hour. We're going to see some snow out ahead of this, heavy wet snow for that system. As we move out over mainland Alaska, fog over southwest Alaska with some lighter snow showers for south central Alaska, and fog also for the Panhandle area, as well as the Arctic coastline from areas of AKwx east. You can see some blowing snow conditions along the northwest coastline where we do have a blizzard warning that is in effect until 6 p.m. on Friday, winds gusting up to as high as 45 miles per hour, and that's specifically for Point Lay and areas further to the west. On Thursday, our main low is going to push further into the Bering Sea with more wind and snow for the central and western Aleutian Islands, starting to push snow further into the Bering Sea and eastern Aleutians as well. Much of the mainland should be dry, as well as down in the Panhandle area with some areas of fog from AKwx east along the Arctic coastline, and continuing to see blowing snow conditions along the northwest coast.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.